in this article. We're getting off to a bit of a late start, and the byline was you guys in conversation with one another. So start and see if everyone can hear you. If need be, you'll have to hold the mic.
Okay.
Right, sure. So it's actually going to be mostly me asking Paul lots of leading questions, no conversation. Because obviously all I do is I edit and I publish, which means I know a very little bit about every topic and nothing in depth. So I could have probably maybe last 6, maybe 5, 6 minutes on this topic, and yeah, that's it. But Paul will carry us through. So debates on technology have gotten quite apolitical lately. If you read Wired.com, if you read other mainstream discussions about robots replacing jobs or new consumer gadgets, it's focused on those things. It's focused on when driverless cars will actually be here. This is the main concern of the Wired set. It's when they'll no longer have to, call for Ubers and have to talk to someone. That's a pressing issue. So, to be fair, there's also it's worse when people Paul Mason talk about technology just by itself ushering in some sort of post-capitalist future through, force of its own innovation or something. But, debates about technology, automations, and changes of production have long been, very much at the center of socialist politics. So the latest issue of Jacobin, which, we passed around, and if you need a copy, I have some extras here, was devoted to kind of trying to bring back a serious political dimension to the discussions. And there's of course some challenges to the discussion. So at once we know that our politics are predicated on kind of a gospel of abundance, which, in a sense admires some of the productivity and the abundance that capitalism has given us, and looks forward to the type of future that awaits humanity once we're able to construct a society that harnesses these forces, but without exploitation, also without drudgery. Capitalism is not only exploitative; it's also based on the persistence of boring, menial tasks that people who have a great amount of creative potential are forced to spend their lives, doing. That's one of the great shames. And obviously, when we leave the capitalist epoch and enter a much better one, that wouldn't be the case. Of course, it can lend itself to this almost form of futurism, which in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when it's detached from politics, I think that's the difference. How do we discuss future possibilities without being futurists, and how do we kind of reconcile the fact that at its core, in day to day, in these factories, these struggles at the workplace, we support worker struggle against automation and against the pace of technological developments, while at the same time not just falling back into very simplistic, rejection of progress, technological progress. So, like I said before, I can't answer these questions very well. That's why, I'm glad we have Paul here, and Paul Heideman is beyond just being a regular Jacobin contributor. He's a PhD student at New York University, and it's a department with lots of great Marxists are there, Vivek Chipper, and they have a lot of great graduate students too. So, in particular, Paul's article on this issue did something that a bunch of our articles didn't. It was meant as a framing article to kind of introduce readers to some of the history of these debates within the socialist left. So it kind of goes through chronologically how everyone from what the utopians thought to what Marx's innovation was, and then onward through the Bolsheviks and in the New Left era, how kind of we've had these debates, and at times there's actually been quite a bit of, and we'll get into this, a bit of regression on how socialists have actually conceived of these issues and the level of complexity they were able to. So I guess I want to start by just asking Paul to lay out I guess as far as you can tell, the dominant opinions on the left today. Are we as a whole naive to the real problems of technological development within capitalism? Or are we on the other extreme? Is there more technophobia and other things prevalent?
Yeah, I would say that in general, I don't think there's a clear trend to left thinking on technology in this moment. I think dominant left thinking is probably neither inappropriately technophobic nor technophilic, although both of those tendencies exist. I think there's not enough thinking about the relationship between socialist strategy, political economy, and technology that's going on. So I think the main task that's needed is clarification more than polemic necessarily at this point, although there is room for polemic. I think, in some of the more kind of theory-heavy ultra-left sections of the left, there is, I think, a technophobia that the phrase that you see sometimes is relations of production are inscribed into the forces of production, right? So certain technologies carry with them relations of domination by their very nature. A lot of times this is used in like descriptions of like logistics technology and that kind of thing. And I think that there's a real danger there of neglecting the technological promise that capitalism has. And there's, I think in socialist thought as a whole, there's been sometimes a tendency to neglect problems of like, okay, how would an alternate mode of production actually work? Like how would a world of nearly 7 billion people actually be fed? Those are problems that if you're serious about overthrowing capitalism can't be neglected in the least. And they're problems that things like logistics technology and that kind of thing actually I think make it easier for us to solve and not harder. So I think I would be very wary of seeing kind of any of the kind of broad branches of technology that are dominant in capitalist production today. I'd be wary of seeing any of them as kind of automatically carrying within them capitalist relations of production. And then on the other side, I think there's also a technophilic thrust, an inappropriate technophilic thrust that the way I read it is that people sometimes see like Marx's description of capitalism in the Communist Manifesto of sweeping away all old modes of production, of all these kind of old forms of bigotry and tradition being swept away by the force of capitalist progress, which of course is an element of capitalism and is there. I think sometimes people have a surface reading of that and apply that kind of framework to like new technologies, right? In a way that ends up almost mirroring kind of libertarian Silicon Valley discourses about disruption and that kind of thing, right? And I think what falls out of those kind of discussions sometimes that just go through kind of like how new technologies are forcing people to reshape their lives in more modern ways and that kind of thing is the question of class power, which is ultimately, I think, for Marxists, for socialists, has to be the central question is how is this new technology's, the manner of this new technology's introduction, right? Not just the technology itself, but how is the manner of its introduction actually affecting class power, working class power itself, because that's what ultimately determines our ability to have a world where everyone has access to plenty. It's perfectly true that all of these technologies are introducing possibilities for production and for leisure, for all kinds of good things in life that most people in the world don't have access to now, but the ability to bring that about is contingent entirely upon the question of class power. And if that isn't at the front of the discussion of how technology is being used and introduced, I think we're missing a big part about what should be most important for socialists.
Right, or you could fall into the trap of if we're just about increasing output and that's how we're going to judge this, then hypothetically, let's say if there's a model of even more authoritarian model of capitalism, let's say what pervades in Singapore, is more effective, then do socialists support that instead of supporting, a kind of a messy working class alternative that might actually mean in the short term, more scarcity and rationing and so on, but it'd be on the basis of, a political system where the working class is in, power.
Yeah.
But, so I guess you explained kind of this outlook that's neither enthused of technology for its own sake, but also isn't like necessarily saying that every single technology is by its very core impossible to kind of reform in a different political standpoint. But for Marx and Engels, for them, how did their view of technology and I guess kind of the scientific socialist view of technology differ to them, the utopians that came before? What were their kind of unique insights? Because I think the only thing that people do here is that all that's solid, melts line, but obviously it was a bit more complex than that.
Yeah, I think if you read like particularly the early Marx, I think the thing that like made an imprint on his mind about technology more than anything else was the contradiction between the amount that capitalism was able to produce in the first decades of the 19th century, the mid 19th century when he's writing his main texts, He is, absolutely floored by just the productive potential that he sees. And the contradiction between that and the fact that there are now economic crises of overproduction, right? That the level of productivity is such that it's actually become a problem for the economic system, right? In the manifesto, there's the line like, a crisis that in all other epochs would have seemed an absurdity, a crisis of overproduction. That contradiction, I think, kind of shook Marx to the core, and a lot of his subsequent thinking on this subject is wrestling with that, of how that comes about and how to understand the contradiction between a world in which enough is produced and a world in which that is it's simultaneously a problem that enough is produced. And so Marx sets out to understand why that is, and I think that's a big part of the project in Capital, is to explain why capitalism is actually such a tremendously productive system. And he, of course, says, what's at the heart of this is actually exploitation. The exploitation of labor and the competition of capital is what produces this technological dynamism. And that's something that I think differentiates Marx and Engels from the utopian socialists in an important way, in that the utopians saw the systemic irrationality of capitalism, right? They saw that, like, this is an anarchic system in which some people have far too much and some people don't have enough. But the way, the kind of element of domination, the presence of class domination, actually, I don't think was as much a part of their thinking as Marx, and certainly not to the degree that, Marx not only had a moral critique of the domination of workers that exploitation brings with it, but also that was part of his theory of capitalism, was that actually you can't have the technological dynamism that characterizes capitalism, particularly a capitalist technological dynamism, without that exploitation. And so, and that then, right, leads directly into the politics that are what really mark the break between Marx and Engels and the utopians, the idea of working class self-emancipation, right? That a new, more rational social order wouldn't be brought about by planners simply kind of sketching out, right? This is utopian socialism in their kind of polemical phrase. It wouldn't just be brought about by people thinking of a better system, but you had to find a social agency that had an interest and a capability in bringing that new system about, and that's workers. So yeah, I think those are kind of the splits that I see between Marx and the utopians.
Right, but Marx died in 1883.
Yes.
So at that point, what was the level of like scientific management or Taylorism? How enmeshed was this in the day-to-day practices of capitalism? Let's say in its most advanced parts of the world, in Germany or England.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, it was obviously very uneven. And I mean, there's a lot of interesting literature coming out now about like management techniques on slave plantations and the way that those actually pioneered a lot of management techniques that were used later. Although, I mean, at the same time, like slave plantations often weren't using the most advanced technology. So there's, a real kind of uneven development phenomena going on there. But Marx distinguished between like three stages of the organization of the labor process technologically. There's handicraft, which is kind of like the way that labor is done is more or less identical to like pre-capitalist labor, where you have kind of people who own their own tools, own their own things, working on something. It's just that now, instead of like being like a small peasant or a small producer, they're actually working for someone else. Then there's manufacture, which is where people who had formerly been like handicraft workers would be gathered together in one location and would now like be supervised, for example. That's a major transition. And then there's modern industry. Modern industry is when manufacture is transformed by the kind of technological redesign of the labor process itself. So like the assembly line is after Marx's time, but that would be like the best, easiest example of how the labor process itself gets redesigned by technology. And when Marx died, modern industry, as he called it, it was actually still not on the scene very much. So it's, it's kind of an impressive periodization that he sees kind of the next form of capitalist work organization that's about to come. So I don't know a lot about England, but in the United States at least, the form of work organization that was really, really prevalent was the hiring out system, where the capitalists would hire workers, and then like the workers themselves would often subcontract people, so that the factory was kind of had three essential levels, right? Owners, the people who work directly for the owners, and then the people that they're subcontracting. So each worker was kind of overseeing a gang of people that they hired, and this was often enmeshed with like an apprentice system, and the workers themselves weren't just like managers who were telling people what to do. They were actually a lot of times doing the most skilled parts of the work, right? So like in like metal workers or people who were in like foundries working with casting metal, like that kind of thing. The workers would, the people who were directly employed by the owner would be kind of like the head worker of a gang. And this was a good system for the capitalists in a lot of ways because it really incentivized technological development on the shop floor because the workers were often paid piece rate, right? And so if they could come up with like a new technique, they would directly reap the results of that, right? That would immediately be something that they'd be able to profit by. And so that was good for capitalists. What was bad for capitalists about this system was that, one, workers maintain, well, the main thing, workers maintain direct control of production, right? Production itself was in no way organized by capital. It wasn't like the capitalist was saying, okay, you're gonna do this, and then you're gonna do this, and you're gonna do this, and you're gonna do that this many times a day, right? It was a piece rate system, and the capitalists oftentimes had no idea how the most detailed parts of the work were done, right? That knowledge was entirely the preserve. Yeah, this would be like 1880 to 1920 in the United States. 1920 is like it's dead by then. So this was a problem for the capitalists. The workers are the ones who know how to do all the work, right? Obviously, this means like for strikes, workers have a tremendous amount of power because now, right, like in most industries today, in most employment, a capitalist can hire replacement workers quite easily because for huge amounts of the American workforce, training someone in that job takes about 4 days, right? Like, I mean, for a huge array of occupations. Well, if you're like a skilled smelter or something like that, right? Like you've worked for years to acquire the knowledge of at what temperature to do this, when to take this out of the fire, right? All of these kinds of like very precise things that if are done wrong will ruin an entire production batch. So the workers' direct control of the production process actually constituted a major problem for capital. And if you read like management journals and like things like that at the time, capitalists are complaining about this all of the time about like their workers know what to do and don't listen to them because like they don't know how to run the things. And this is where Taylorism comes in because there's decades where capital realizes this is a problem but doesn't have an alternate system, an alternate way to organize the labor process. And Taylor comes in and says, okay, here's how you do it. And Taylorism can be boiled down to, as Harry Braverman does in Labor and Monopoly Capital, 3 points. The first is management has to acquire to itself full knowledge of the production process. So if you want to be a manager, if you want to be a capitalist, you have to learn how everything in your factory is done if you want to be an effective controller. That's the first step. The second is you need to separate workers from that knowledge. So not only do you have to know it, you have to be in a situation where your workers don't know it, right? Which means you're not going to be hiring like skilled craft labor anymore. And then the third step is using that knowledge to redesign every aspect of the labor process so that every aspect is under control of the capitalist, right? And again, the assembly line is like the best example of how this is done because it's the easiest way to see like now the pace of work is no longer governed by the workers themselves. Now the pace of work can be set by someone who's in a head office up above the shop floor who is studying how fast they think that the assembly line should be going, right? And so that's the solution that capital comes to of how the problem of worker control of production can be done. You have to separate workers from their knowledge of production, and you have to design a productive process such that they can't take control of it again, right? So that each person is doing one little thing and doesn't know how the person next to them is doing it. That was the Taylorist program. And the organization of production has changed in a lot of ways since then, in that like with lean production methods that have kind of proliferated since the 1980s, the kind of individual task work is no longer as characteristic of a lot of kind of management plans as it used to be. But the basic principle of separating workers from control over the labor process has been enduring, and that's been Taylor's major contribution.
So to shift more to the political aspect, And maybe I'm mentioning too many groups for you to reasonably tackle, so you could ignore some and focus on others you think you're more interested. But from on the trade union side, the response of groups like the Knights of Labor, but also more radical groups like later emerged the Wobblies, and in particular the response of obviously there was some overlap with the Wobblies, of course, and it's left wing, but the Socialist Party of America. What was the response of, I guess, this left broadly consumed, this early workers movement in the U.S. context to these developments? Was it just machine breaking, like we've led to believe, or was there more to it than that?
Yeah, so the Knights of Labor, which was like one of the first kind of big industrial unions in the United States, where the Knights of Labor, yep. The Knights of Labor kind of encapsulated the ideology of these kind of skilled laborers who were under assault in the late 19th century. And for a while, I mean, they grew to be a huge organization for a while, thousands upon thousands of members. And their ideology was like the kind of skilled craftsmen who, and it was often a man that they were talking about, who controlled the labor process, was like the foundation. These were the productive members of our society. The bosses were the people who were unproductive, right? They were just kind of taking the profits, which was, as far as like a basis for kind of a class struggle goes, not the worst ideology in the world. Although it led to kind of a blurring of class lines in that they didn't see they didn't have a conceptualization of like the working class itself, of people who have to sell their labor for a living. So like they kind of would tend to amalgamate the class situation of like workers and farmers, for example, in a kind of general producerist ideology. And you can see the kind of material basis for this sort of ideology in a world where like your boss literally has no idea how the job is done. Right, you can see why like it's the kind of ideology that you take is, well, this guy's just useless, right? He's just like taking our what we make. But they fight what is ultimately a losing battle against the attempt to Taylorize and to crush the power of craft labor. And I don't know a ton about what they wrote about technology. I don't know if anyone's actually written about like Knights of Labor on technology, but I don't think they.
For your third PhD.
Yeah, I don't know if they spent a lot of time theorizing it, because in the late 19th century, it wasn't yet the introduction of technology that was being used to break labor as much, right? It was more just kind of naked class conflict itself. So in the early decades of the 20th century, with like the development of the assembly line, for example, is when like technological techniques of production start to be used kind of more directly as weapons of class struggle. The Wobblies are, in many ways, the heirs to the Knights of Labor. With the Knights of Labor didn't have this saying, but one big union was in many ways what they were for. And the Wobblies, of course, were famous for sabotage, right, as a weapon. The Wobblies understood perfectly well the role of introducing technology in the workplace as a weapon of class struggle against workers, as a way to crush workers. They understood the toll that took on workers' lives. I mean, this was what motivated them. And one of their responses, the most famous response, was sabotage, right? Which is usually associated with like dynamite, right? But actually had a much more nuanced meaning in Wobbly ideology, where for the Wobblies, sabotage was anything which stops production, right? The word sabotage comes from the French word sabot, for like a French shoe, or a wooden shoe that was like really awkward and clumsy. So like sabotage in Wobbly terms just meant kind of dragging your feet, slowing down production. So like what we would like
Thrown into the gear. The shoes were the wooden shoes that were
they're thrown in the gear. But the Wobblies also like what we would call like work to rule. Like a union campaign to slow down production by just fulfilling the contract exactly and not doing any of the extra stuff that workers are always expected to do. Like for the Wobblies, that was considered sabotage, right? Sabotage encompassed a whole range of activities that were all meant at the phrase they used was the conscious withdrawal of efficiency. Which is pretty good, especially in light of like the obsession of like progressive era managers with efficiency. Like efficiency was a buzzword of the intellectual class at that time, who were very much into Taylorism. and that kind of thing.
And also middle-class reformers. 'Cause
Totally.
when we think about the progressive era, we often, like, I think now, especially with the left so defeated and distanced, we kind of have blurred the line between what was essentially a middle-class crusades against corruption and other inefficiency, and a kind of a very distinct class interest on the other side among workers.
And the campaigns against corruption were often directed directly against working class institutions and interests, things like that.
Right.
Yeah, the legacy of progressivism for the Wobblies had a very clear view on what the progressive movement and those kind of intellectuals actually represented. But I think the Wobblies, although they published some really good analysis of the introduction of machinery and the way that, in exactly the way that Marx describes in chapter 25 of Capital, the way that the introduction of machinery leads to a reserve army of labor that is used as a weapon to keep wages down for the class as a whole. The Wobblies had a really good understanding of that. I think what they lacked was a strategy of what the working class could do in the face of this, besides sabotage, strikes, etc., right? Which is, is something that we can, I think, hardly judge them too harshly for, because, this was a period of massive, an unprecedented attack on the working class with the introduction of all these new technologies, the efficiency men with stopwatches coming in to measure every movement, right? All of that kind of stuff was shocking to the class. And so it's hard to judge them too harshly for, I think, not having a strategy for how the class, because this, in hindsight, it's easy to see, well, this is going to be a long-term battle at that point. And I think the Wobblies didn't develop a strategy for how to conduct that long-term battle in a way that you're going to lose some over, how to deal with defeat, in the most blunt terms.
So in other words, how do you go from just resistance and knowing your immediate class interest with building some sort of strategy that could, wider, can also connect to a wider, what's a medium-term and long-term interest of the workers' movement as a whole, which is actually a very difficult conception. So I guess maybe we should go immediately right ahead to Braverman and to other people, but we won't, of course, because we're Marxists. So we need to pause and reflect on the Bolshevik Revolution. It's been, we've been talking for 45 minutes. We haven't mentioned the Bolshevik Revolution. No, but I mean, this is actually a very, because this actually does, though, bring in a whole nother set of problems. Because it wasn't merely trying to manage the interests of workers and how to manifest that interest against the interests of clearly exploiting classes. How do you manage the interest of a worker state with the interests of particular workers? So I imagine that debates raged in the early years of the Soviet Union when debates were still a thing that could happen. So in other words, what were I guess the first society that attempted to deploy technology on a different class basis? What were some of the debates? Was the early years of the Russian Revolution qualitatively different as far as the relationship workers felt in the factory with regards to technology? And I guess it's a difficult question, partially because of the overall chaos and deprivation of those years. It's hard to kind of separate those two.
Yeah, I think that, thank you. I think that, it's very hard to say what workers felt with regard to technology in the Soviet Union. The working class was in a state of chaos from day one, basically, as soon as the Bolsheviks came to power. But, debates absolutely raged throughout the early years, the heroic years of the Soviet Union on the role of Taylorism in particular, because people like Lenin, looked at Taylorism in the West, and in a situation where production was collapsing, where they were already in the most backward country in Europe, looked to these kind of techniques of production and were like, well, we could use some of that. Frankly, we don't have anything. Well, anything that's going to increase production, we can use. And Lenin had actually written about Taylorism before the October Revolution, and had some good stuff to say. He said, as long as capitalism is around, scientific production will be nothing but the extortion of sweat. He understood actually what was going on with it. But in the crucible of revolution, I think that side of things dropped away, and Lenin, I think, even in the early writings, kind of the way he phrases it is like, as long as we're under capitalism, these techniques are the extortion of sweat. I don't think that Lenin grasped that those techniques are useless outside of capitalism, right? The techniques of Taylorism, as summarized by kind of Braverman's 3 laws, are techniques for controlling labor in a situation in which labor is sold to capital and exploited, right? They're not techniques that enhance productivity in some kind of neutral way, right? And I don't think Lenin understood that about Taylorism. And to be fair, I mean, no one, until Braverman wrote his book in the early 70s, no one had like formalized that and gotten to the heart of what Taylorism represented in that way. So again, it's easy to judge in hindsight, particularly when we're not trying to restore production in the midst of a civil war. But I think Lenin failed to see how Taylorism is entirely a creature of capitalism, and that the techniques of Taylorist production are meaningless outside of it and won't do anything.
And Antonio Gramsci had even more eccentric views on like Fordism and Taylorism and what it meant.
Right. Gramsci, again, coming from the south of Italy and totally underdeveloped, you can understand the attraction of someone to these techniques of production that promise so much more, that promise abundance. But Gramsci, writing from his prison cell, developed a theory of Fordism, as he called it, after Henry Ford, that it was quite strange, and essentially it said that Fordism and Taylorism and the scientific reorganization of production has started under capitalism, but can only be completed under socialism, right? He kind of, in the kind of classic Marxist model of like the relations of production fettering the forces of production, right? Like he kind of saw Fordism and Taylorism in that light, as they were fettered by the relations of production of capitalism. Again, not understanding that they don't exist outside of it. They are weapons of class war that only make sense in the context of a war between capital and labor. And he also then linked them with these really strange ideas about kind of like modern man and like sexual puritanism. He really thought that like that there was too much sexual immorality among the working class, that sexual immorality came from the middle classes, and that the working class family was a good kind of proletarian family with a man and a wife and some kids, this kind of very conservative mythology, actually. And he then linked it in stuff about prohibition, too, and that he said that, like, in the United States, the workers support prohibition, and it's really all those degenerate bourgeoisie who are for drinking alcohol and stuff like that. He was in Italy, so he didn't really know what was going on, but it was all kind of part of this general theory of, like, the scientific organization and the industrial organization of the labor process being something that was like launched under capitalism and that workers had an interest in but couldn't be completed under capitalism, and so in a lot of ways Gramsci is kind of the thinker in like the kind of classical tradition who I think deviates farthest from like the core set on understanding technology by Marx.
Right, or even Marx's nuance.
Yeah.
But I guess this is the one case that we at least have some. It's somewhat heartening that we've actually gotten better about thinking about these issues since this kind of the era when I guess maybe it took until already we shed mass parties and our ability to actually change the world, we were able to maybe understand a little bit better. So in particular, there's a work of Braverman that you've been mentioning. You also mentioned kind of a much more neglected pamphlet by Chris Harman. I kind of wanted you to get into the Harman, but also talk about perhaps how Braverman's monopoly capitalism was misinterpreted, perhaps, or
Yeah. Well, so on Chris Harman was an intellectual with the British International Socialist, then Socialist Workers' Party, who in the late 70s, when technology was being introduced, in particular into like British office work in a way that it hadn't been before, wrote a pamphlet about how workers could deal with this that I think had some real insights that haven't really been articulated anywhere else about what kind of technological, new techniques of production in the workplace mean for worker organization. And Harman kind of understood a key point about the way that the way in particular that a union bureaucracy aimed at essentially preserving a kind of stability in the workplace, which means often defending workers' rights, but can also mean not taking risks that need to be taken, could come to terms with a kind of technological progress in a way that would, in the long term, be disastrous for working class power on the shop floor. So he talks about, like, you know, it's not enough, he says, for when workers are fighting around technology in the workplace to say no one is going to be fired, right? Because this would be a really common thing that like unions would fight for. Like, okay, if you're in office work and they're introducing computers, the boss would say, okay, well, we only need 2/3 of these workers now because everyone's going to work so much faster, so we can fire 1/3 of them. And the union would say, no, you're not firing anyone. We're going to keep current staffing levels. Well, the problem with that is even if you win no firings, attrition over time is going to allow the same thing to happen, right? It's going to allow that speed up to happen in the same way. And that's that's been something that's just been endemic in the United States, that kind of change in the workplace. And so Harman said you actually have to fight for something much more specific in your contract language. You have to fight. You can't fight for just maintaining a certain level of employment or for no firings. You have to fight in ways that preserves the ability of workers on the shop floor to actually stop production, right? You have to look at the techniques of production that are being introduced and evaluate them based on their future effects on worker power, not just their current effects on employment levels, wage levels, things like that. And obviously that looks very different in different kinds of workplaces, but that was kind of the gist of the argument, and that's something I think that like the Wobblies lost, right? The Wobblies didn't have a conception of. And I think that's absolutely necessary because, if the fight is only to stop new techniques of production from being introduced, we're going to lose that fight so many times, right? I mean, the working class is so weak right now. We need a strategy for when we lose, right? For when new techniques of production are going to be introduced, that kind of thing. We need to be thinking about what are the kind of strategies that preserve class power even when we've lost the immediate battle, right? That needs to be the outlook. And I think Harman's pamphlet does a good job of kind of sketching out some of what that could look like.
Right.
And then, on Braverman and kind of, Braverman's book kind of charted a whole new area of research, right? This kind of labor process research of how work is organized and how the conflict on the factory floor is managed. And there's been a lot of debate about it, lots and lots of pages. One kind of prominent line of critique has been that Braverman has neglected worker resistance and how workers actually disrupt what managers are trying to do to them, what capitalists are trying to do to them. Which is true, he doesn't talk very much about, but I think it's a misreading of the book because the book is about this is what capital's strategy is, and this is how capital's strategy is not just like some quirk of American capitalism, but is actually built into the social relations of capitalist production. That this need to separate workers from the knowledge of production and to divide the labor process is an imperative that exists upon all capitalists and that flows out of the basic class relations. So, if that's the level on which the argument is happening, the whole argument is premised on the idea that workers are going to resist what capitalists do to them, And I think he then kind of lays out the framework for how to understand it. And then subsequent people have really filled that in. So Dan Clausen wrote this book that's like a follow-up to Braverman called Bureaucracy and the Labor Process that goes through exactly this history of how production changed, how workers resisted, all of that kind of thing. So I think even if Braverman doesn't talk about it, he gave you the framework for understanding the dynamic of resistance and class assaults that played out.
Right, and also given Braverman's own background as a socialist and as a worker,
right.
Of course he's,
the idea that he didn't understand resistance,
right,
he was a metal worker,
Yeah. So I guess just to conclude, before we open up for a brief Q&A, just on maybe some practical kind of takeaways as far as the lesson from particularly the Harman and Braverman kind of tradition of dealing with technology. Some have brought up the fact that obviously, let's say given the environmental crisis and also the changes in technology, we have maybe the ability now to get rid of some work that can not only be somewhat automated, some of it's actually socially undesirable in certain ways. So for example, one can think of coal mining, right? And you could say that in fact, coal mining is socially undesirable work. It's undesirable not only for in a certain extent for the workers doing it, but for society as a whole. But of course, mass unemployment is also undesirable, and there's a reason why people fight and resist. Coal mining is also the reason why For very good reasons, there's sections of the working class that fight for things like Keystone XL and whatnot.
Yeah.
So some have brought up, for example, the concept of a universal basic income, or in a particular more targeted basis. In other words, why don't we, instead of having this false dichotomy between bad work like coal mining and the very true reality that there's communities that rely on it, instead pay people $60,000 to $80,000 a year not to mine coal and to do whatever they want. So, to try to break through that scarcity that's kind of imposed on this discourse and serve the interests of capitalists. What do you think about those kind of arguments? Is the bottom line, I guess, drawing from Braverman and others, just does it weaken or strengthen the working class movement as a whole? Or is there dangers in perhaps, in other words, taking these workers and other jobs in the future that could be automated or done away with and taking them away from production where workers actually have power? Does that make sense?
I mean, coal miners are a great example because, like, actually in the late 1960s and early 70s, when there was, a real streak of radicalism in the coal miners unions in the United States with Miners for Democracy and things like that, a significant section of the mining unions was fighting for the abolition of coal mining. Like the radical coal miners were fighting for the abolition of their own jobs, right? Which is not something workers do very often today. Right, in a context where you have levels of unemployment that are much higher, that kind of demand falls away. And you can understand, and it's a window into kind of like the political opportunity or the political imagination that accompanies a much more powerful working class movement that's actually structurally in a better position to strike at capital than we are today, primarily because of unemployment, right? Unemployment is the great weapon against working class radicalism. In conditions that that approached full employment, it was feasible for a section of the class to be like, our work is socially destructive, it's dangerous, we don't want to do it, we want other jobs, we want this industry eliminated. And I think like that's the vision we need to look to in terms of like thinking about these kinds of undesirable work. I think the hard thing to realize is like that kind of political imagination doesn't exist without a material foundation of class power of a kind that just doesn't exist today, that's just a hard truth that we have to grapple with, and there's no way around it, right? That kind of ideology taking hold in the class itself isn't going to happen no matter how good the socialist movement agitates around it, And I think like regarding universal basic income, I think it's complicated because like obviously it would be, that would enhance class power by so much, I'm not sure whether that is more realistic than a return to full employment capitalism, both of which seem really unrealistic at this point, to be frank.
The polling on full jobs guarantee, it's not phrased like full employment, is something like 47%, like some recent poll put out. So this is one quite radical demand, quite to the left of even what social democrats or others would accede to, that actually people think of quite, as common sense, because they want jobs and they want security. And also it's not perceived in any ideological way as anything more than, it's not perceived as a universal welfare program or something like that.
And it's funny, like universal basic income in the 70s was perceived in exactly that way, as just like a technical fix that was, Milton Friedman endorsed like a negative income tax, and the Nixon administration started to experiment with universal, they didn't call it universal basic income, but essentially a basic income program. That
national college debate topic.
and then it was essentially killed very quickly once capital figured out what was actually going on with it. But it's funny, it was seen like exactly that way, as just kind of merely a technical thing. But as the crisis of the 70s drew on, it became clear very soon that guaranteeing workers an income was anything but like a technical fix, right? That was something with explosive political implications. And so I think, I think we have to in some ways be modest about our what we want for in terms of these kind of aims of undesirable work, automation, universal basic income, and realize that there's a material foundation to these things that doesn't exist today.
And the left can't shape ourselves. So if we just focus on the forward march of progress and elimination of a lot of these jobs, we should also be aware that the working class isn't shaping this forward march at the moment. Therefore, it's probably undermining our interests much more than it's aiding it.
Yeah, exactly.
But on that rosy note,
Can you say that again?
I was saying that, in other words, when we talk about technology today, if we're rosy about it, we ignore the fact that these developments, debates aren't being necessarily pushed or directed by, let's say, the working class action itself. Therefore, it's probably working to undermine working class power. I guess from that point, maybe we should switch over to Q&A just for a few minutes. Or?
I need to, there seems to be an issue with this mic. 1 second. Yeah, the mic is red. Power down. I almost have people speak loud. Everyone, when you ask your question, you need to speak loud so that we can hear it on the live stream. Thank you, Paul and Bhaskar. Very good presentation.
Thank you.
I'm sure there are lots of comments and questions. One at a time, or do you want to take a few?
Let's take like 3 or 4 at a time.
Yeah, like 3 or something.
Okay, so I will go left to right, even though I've changed already. Steve, Bill, and Chad. You're the first 3. Okay, go ahead.
I would just love to hear you riff on Uber.
Oh, okay.
There's been a lot of talk recently about technological unemployment. Of course,
Oh, yeah.
there's always been a lot of talk about technological unemployment. One person in particular, a Martin Ford, who is by no means a Marxist himself, but an IT, a technologist and an entrepreneur, and he has done a lot of research on that, and also based on a empirical Oxford study on unemployment, estimate that up to 40% or more of jobs could be lost. Now, I've been in IT for many years, and it's persuasive in the sense that the new technology, particularly general artificial intelligence and learning machines, are very different than any technology that we've had in the past, in the sense that the older technologies were application specific. They performed a particular job. A loom only produced cloth.
Right.
A foundry only produced iron or steel. These new technologies can practically learn any type of work process, and therefore are fundamentally different than the previous technologies. And yet I don't really hear any sort of talk about how we're going to face this situation, if in fact it's true, because some of these predictions are close term in terms of being maybe 10 to 20 years away.
Thanks a lot for the discussion. I was wondering if Harman, and I may have missed it, if Harman used an example, because I thought it was really insightful, this distinction between organizing around retaining employment levels versus targeting either some part of the technology's introduction that would actually increase class power. And so I'm wondering if Harman used an example. You brought up computers eliminating a third of the workforce. And if Harman didn't use an example, do you have other examples maybe, especially with like sharing economy technology, with Uber? So maybe this brings it back to the, thank you.
Okay, yeah. I mean, Uber is so funny because like it's being sold as like this massive disruption, but it's not actually like even technological progress. It's just an app that's convenient, you know? And it's the kind of thing that like, it's not a new technology that's gonna change the way cabs work. It's just a better way to hail a cab. The thing about it that's politically, that's politically problematic is the way that it's being used to assault, existing taxi drivers unions and things like that. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that, the way the taxi system works in New York is not particularly progressive in any number of ways, right? But Uber is so self-consciously like, we're disrupting everything, everything's gonna change. And then the way they treat their own employees, right? The kind of like you're an individual contractor, so you can't unionize, you know, you have no rights, all of that kind of thing. But it's like, it's just funny to me the way it's sold as like this massive disruption when like from the standpoint, like, you know, over the 20th century, like the number of hours that it takes to make a car has dropped, you know, by like, you know, many fold, many times over, right? By many orders of magnitude. You compare that to like Uber, and it's just like, you know, this is what capitalism has to offer us now. It's like, it's pathetic, you know, in terms of thinking in terms of technological change.
Right.
It's just it's just a way of organizing. The thing that like actually is a change about it has nothing to do with technology and is everything to do with how the labor force is organized. You know, a dispersed group of workers who don't work for one employee, right, or who are all separate contractors who aren't co-workers. That's the stuff that's actually disruptive, and that kind of like remaking of the workforce is old, right? Like there's nothing new about that. So I think in that sense, I find that like the debate around Uber funny in the way it gets like polarized in these terms around like technological stuff. The technology has just nothing to do with what makes Uber a problem, you know?
We're boosting Uber's valuation probably by buying into the myth that it's, you know, disrupting and changing everything.
Right. Like the technology itself could easily be integrated with the existing like yellow cab system in New York, you know? Like those two things aren't like totally contradictory. So that's funny. On like AI and stuff, I'm by no means an expert on this. But I'm generally a skeptic on this kind of thing. We've been really disappointed by forecasts around AI in the past, you know. There have been huge periods where AI research has just like stagnated almost. And the ability of AI to handle all kinds of things is really problematic. Now maybe that's going to change in the future. You know, again, I'm by no means an expert, but kind of past experience leads me to be skeptical. But I think the thing that like people like Ford miss is, you know, a part of what Marx lays out in Capital is that the general employment level isn't set by like technology and skills, it's set by accumulation, right? And if there's accumulation going on, if capital is healthily accumulating and there's a body of workers who are being thrown out of production, capital will find a use for them, right? Because their wages are being pushed down by unemployment, right? There's actually an adjustment mechanism within capital that makes, as long as there's actual capital accumulation taking place, there's, you know, people are going to be reabsorbed in worse jobs, in worse conditions. You know, it's not going to be a good thing. But this kind of permanent joblessness, this endless expansion of the reserve army of labor, is a scenario that I don't think is likely in conditions of ongoing capital accumulation. Now, in conditions that we've had for the last few years where growth has been extremely weak, I think we start to look at something different, right? Like, if there's a long-term stagnation of capitalist accumulation in which there aren't new bursts of accumulation in which the reserve army is sucked back into production, then I think we're in much worse shape. That's a much scarier proposition, the absence of future rounds of capitalist growth, right? I mean, the left often thinks that periods of crisis are our time, right? They're when we're going to advance. But a crisis for capitalism is a much worse crisis for the working class. You know, it disorganizes us much more than it disorganizes them. And so, you know, if growth continues to be anemic for decades, I think, you know, then that kind of thing becomes more likely. But in the presence of, you know, kind of normal cycles of capitalist growth, I don't think the kind of apocalyptic predictions are likely to be borne out. And then on Harman, so I don't remember. You know, it's been a while since I've looked at the pamphlet. I think there are, and you can look it up online. I think it's named in the article. But the kind of like innovation in the labor process, the kind of introduction of technology that I think it's important to fight around, are technologies that actually directly undermine control of the labor process itself, right? So like the introduction of things that govern the pace of work outside of workers. So like in a call center, right? A lot of I mean, this is a fight that we've already lost. But for example, in call centers, it's gone from where it used to be that the people in the call center who are like making the calls would make the calls themselves to it being fully automated. So you just have a headset that's hooked into a computer, and as soon as one call ends, you're on to the next call, right? Like that's the kind of thing that that absolutely has to be targeted, because that's taking control further out of the hands of the workers themselves. They no longer are controlling the pace of work. So like your ability to like mount a slowdown, for example, or like a work to rule campaign, the kind of flexibility that you have, like now you have to either not do your work or do it at their pace, right? Whereas if workers have control over the pace that they're making calls, they have a much broader array of tactics that they can use against the boss. And, you know, I mean, that's the kind of thing where like, right, a work to rule campaign, for example, is much easier to mount than an all-out strike. And so those are the kinds of innovations in the workplace that I think it's very important for workers to directly challenge, ones that take control of the labor process further away from workers. And of course, like, not all introductions of technology do that. So like, you know, the introduction of computers itself in people like, you know, in office work in the 70s and 80s, that didn't necessarily directly remove control of production from the hands of workers in the same way that, say, the assembly line or the automation of call centers did. And so those are the kinds of things that it's really important to target.
The Harman pamphlet is named "Is a Machine After Your Job?"
Yeah. It's a good title.
Yeah, and it's available online in lots of different places.
So Mary, then Michael, and then Mitch. Wait.
There are a lot of things I wanted to dive off about because I thought they were really important.
You have to hold this up. It's live streaming. We don't hear.
I wanted to be in a conversation adding, but unfortunately I'm only going to deal with one thing and show a difference because it's so important to me. The thing on accumulation, you're both right and you're wrong. I mean, in volume 1, when he goes through the entire process, and then you get to volume 3, but the general absolute law of capitalist accumulation, you're absolutely right that the number of people working has to grow continuously or capital doesn't accumulate. And the problem is that those workers are producing much, much more. Mm-hmm. So I was a particular thing of my interest. So I study actually the growth of population over time and the workforce. If you go back, I just did one recently actually. You went back a couple hundred years, and you see that when capitalism developed, there's a jump. It skyrockets. Goes like this. Then it starts to level off. And it's a constant increase. Marx explains this. It must because of the accumulation. You know, it has to produce more value, not less. So you've got to even hire more workers because you're expanding. So, and that means you also have to produce many more goods because they're much more productive. But what happens is, as the productivity of labor increases, the entire population of the world grows, the entire number of people producing in the workforce grows, the reserve army of labor grows, the absolute surplus population grows. But because the workers are more productive, there is less work relative to dead labor, which means also in terms of society, the relative position of those working declines relative to the reserve army, to the latent, and all of those people within the different stratification makes, and the absolute surplus population grows significantly in relative terms. Everything grows absolutely, but the relative proportions in society, there is an impact on the number of people who are unemployed, which is only one category of the working class, the proletariat, and the absolute permanently unemployed grows proportionally. And the amount engaged in actual production relatively declines, though everything is growing. We are in a crisis. Humanity is in a crisis, and this is with accumulation going on. Even in depressions, the workforce grows, the population grows, the workforce grows, the unemployed grow, and the absolute. Relatively more in depressions are unemployed and absolute. But that's all growing. This is a major contradiction about why this is an irrational system. So you have to switch that argument around. The core of it's right, but the actual crisis, this is one of the major crises besides the crisis of nature, and the crisis of the dehumanization of human beings. You know, so all that's going on. But this is a crucial dynamic that is going on, and we ignore the absolute surplus population. Most of that, I don't even know it as a category. You know, and it's immense now. And when you combine that with the fact that one of the brokerage firms some years ago took the food prices off the commodities markets, so it's no longer regulated by supply and demand, but by fictitious capital, by derivatives. So it became you now trade the monetary, the fiscal, the instrument. So the prices of food overnight rose, which meant the working classes, who the disenfranchised, dispossessed, completely with no work, starvation and everything grew. Hunger and starvation, disease from hunger and starvation grew massively. So this whole development of financialization of capital that's going on with the accumulation of capital creates relatively more unemployed and absolutely unemployed, who are all part of the proletariat. This is part of the class struggle. We have to incorporate that into our whole struggle, what it's about. I'll leave it at that. I have other things I'd love to talk to you about.
Do you want to take on what
Oh no, we can do a group. We can do a group.
Michael?
Thank you. I was wondering how you think technology could address certain like basic fronts of class struggle, like housing, like especially in a city like New York.
And Mitch.
Yep.
Thanks. So this is very provocative and very interesting, especially as Nixon was the main pusher of the minimum guaranteed wage.
Yeah.
So we have that to think about, and also the Clean Water Act and the Fresh Air Act. So Nixon was our last liberal president.
Right.
So I think that all socialists have to have as part of our position or program an end to the assembly line as part of whatever it is that we're fighting for, and an end to the factory form of production. But I don't see many Marxists then thinking of how can production continue except through the factory form. And so, and there's a utopian aspect to that as well. So I'd like you to talk about that a little more. Getting to the Taylor part, there's that old story of Taylor, a time and motion person coming to a factory and talking to the workers and saying, well, if you could plane your piece of wood and put a pad on your elbow, you could buffer and shine what you're planing at the same time, at the same time. And the worker responded, well, if you could take your notes and stick a broom up your ass, you could sweep the floor while you're taking your notes at the same time. But I'd like to hear more about the fight around technology, which for the Luddites was in 1811, was not just, it was not about stopping all machinery, which we conflate with technology. Those are not the same. So I'd like to hear you describe that a bit more also.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, on kind of the surplus population, I think it's complicated because like the operation of the reserve army of labor is actually nationally delimited. The degree to which the unemployed elsewhere in the world push down wages on U.S. workers or workers in any country, national boundaries actually serve to fragment the operation of a global reserve army of labor. And so while there's, I agree, it's important to see like the growth of absolute, explosion of slums, the growth of absolute surplus populations and that kind of thing, although I'm by no means an expert on that. I think the national frame is really important there because the absolute surplus population doesn't undermine the ability of workers in countries in which employment is growing or not shrinking as fast. It doesn't undermine them in the same way. Like an unemployed person who's in the labor market with the workers that you're analyzing in this case exerts downward pressure in a way that someone who's not in that labor market doesn't. And so I think that's actually really important for understanding the dynamics of class power that we're talking about, that the growth of an absolute surplus army doesn't operate as one global surplus army of labor. So in terms of the implications for class power, I think that's really important. I don't know the number. Yeah.
What about outsourcing? Yes, there's a national process that goes on, but it's also an international economy now, global. It's a global economy.
Yeah, but outsourcing
the reserve army of labor. I mean, they can move somewhere else where it's cheaper, and they're hiring proportionally less labor to technology than they were before because of the productivity of labor. So we are in a. I think it's rather strange that you would say today. That argument was very. You could use much more strongly. Well, you'd have to go back at least 30 years to say that, because by the 70s it was already the new phase of capital, this stage that we're now really seeing fully expressed. So right now there is a global, I mean, there's a few very large, you could, 100 people you could virtually can say control the major spheres of production completely from beginning to end in the circulation around the world. It's international. And there are people in India and here doing the same telecommunications and all of that under the same corporations. And they're going to go where it's cheaper. I mean, China's doing that now. Who's going to Africa and stuff now? China's going to Africa because it's cheaper and they can do the manufacturing and so on. I mean, and it's exactly an expression of the fact that there's a huge, immense reserve army of labor and absolute surplus population that has lost it. The working class has no compatibility now to do anything about it. And their unions are gone and everything else. So it's part of that process. I don't know how you can argue that. Your basic concept is right about the accumulation process of growing, but the contradictions inside capital are at work that are powerful, and they continue to grow and get more contradictory and more crisis-ridden.
Well, capital isn't footloose and fancy-free. Capital actually isn't able to outsource whatever they want. They're able to outsource significant amounts of production, but for example, in the United States, regionalization of production has been just as significant a trend of plant relocation and plant closings as actual outsourcing outside of the country. You know, so it's not the case that like capital is able to just pack up and go. Things like transportation infrastructure and actually the skill levels of workers set major limits on capital's ability to relocate where they want to go. And of course, huge amounts of production simply can't be outsourced, right? Like the construction industry, you can't pack up and leave because you're building in one place, you know?
I live in the Heideman area that's completely being renovated. It's a form of financial capital. They are hiring non-unionized labor. Most of them are immigrants. They're come from anywhere. The wages are low. They're unskilled. They don't need to be because it's all prefab. And when the U.S. didn't want to do manufacturing anymore, it went over to China and other places and they did other things.
No, that's not.
That's just not true.
Well, let's say.
I know there's a national context, which we're still living within the world of national economies, but I can't. I mean, you're talking to me about the post World War II and post Bretton Woods. I mean, what you're describing is post Bretton Woods. It's not the reality now.
I mean,
manufacturing is kind of reaching in many ways its peak now. Like if you say what year did automobile?
You're right that certain modes of production within the larger mode of production are more difficult to move, and they're more locally based and can't be transferred and stuff. There's there's all kinds of different modes of production. Marx talks about this kind of thing all the time, and which ones could be and transitional stuff and everything. So yes, there are those that are locally rooted that can't be easily gotten rid of and gone somewhere else. But the world now, so fundamental labor processes so fundamentally changed since the Second World War, and in a global throughout the world, not just here in the United States, that it is easier to move, and the unions are done, and de-skilling has gone down. So you can substitute anyone for anyone else in the service industries and so on and so on. You can keep going on and on and on. I don't need to, this, I'm sure. So yes, there are certain spheres, certain modes of production within the mode of production that will be more locally rooted. But in general, that's not the process. And the companies now are owned by different people from anywhere in the world. So it's a different process. I mean, I agree with you. You're talking about an earlier period.
I would say I would just say just one last thing on this, that it's of course true that all of the dynamics you're describing have intensified in the last 40 years. But it's easy for us to overstate them. And I think the left has actually been overstating them for the dynamic of globalization, of outsourcing, of all of that kind of thing. If you look at like the kind of, there's corridors of outsourcing that run along very clear spatial lines that don't just go anywhere in the world because, for all kinds of production, it's just not feasible to ship it anywhere yet. And so I think the left has too often overstated those dynamics, and that biases our analysis. But on the housing question, I mean, I think housing is an interesting one because like housing is one where we don't need any technology to solve the housing question. There are millions of homes in the United States that are unoccupied right now, and there are, you know, there's like 6 unoccupied homes for every homeless person in the United States, you know. So like in terms of this is one of those areas where like capitalism has obviously reached the level of abundance that is necessary for housing in you know, in the United States. You know, elsewhere in the world, I don't know very much about the housing question, so I can't say about like what housing might look like there. But like at least in the advanced capitalist countries, the level of productivity is such that everyone could have a decent home. With, you know, the decent home's already there. We don't have to do anything.
Homes, maybe.
Yeah, everyone could have a vacation home, you know, or share a vacation home at least. That it's one of those areas where like capitalism has stopped promising more. You know, for a long time, like technological progress was like the promise of capitalism. You're gonna have more. There's gonna be, you know, progress is gonna deliver more tomorrow, and that was like a justification of capitalism. Now it's the opposite. Now it's like, well, technological process is inevitable, and that's why your lives are terrible. That's why you're unemployed. You know, it's shifted to the opposite, and like housing is one of those areas where that's so clear. Where like you know, the material basis exists completely from start to finish. It's already built, and it's still not even promised at all. So I don't know if there was something, maybe I'm missing part of the question and there was something more specific there, but that's kind of my basic take.
What's interesting on, I don't know if you've ever seen HGTV, but the new program for people looking for homes is the tiny house.
Oh, right, yeah.
So there's this whole setup that you don't deserve the kind of space one can live a decent life in, but you should aspire to be cramped and barely move your elbow from this point forward.
Yeah.
And the same channels have all those terrible shows attacking hoarders, so you could see it's like, you know, just against working class consumption.
What about the factory floor?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by the factory. Right, like production outside the factory. If you mean lots of workers, lots of people working in one place on a common project, I don't think we can do without that. If you mean something that's, you know, the assembly is something that's hierarchical, that has different levels of bureaucratic control that are sharply delimited, the separation of execution and conception, that kind of thing, you know, if that's what you mean by the factory, I absolutely agree that we need to get rid of all of that. But yeah, I'm for large-scale production on a democratic basis. You know, it's kind of I think so. Yeah.
Well, and also the demands would come out of the workers' movement. If you're at the point where you could pose those questions, if the workers' movement isn't actually posing those questions, then perhaps the working class, these workers are okay with that level of production if it means they only have to do it 4 hours a week, and if they can elect their management, and if they have different social rights, like maybe then their main demands aren't around kind of like less alienation, it's just less time being alienated and no exploitation because they now own the factory.
Yeah, and I would say if large-scale production, democratic large-scale production is not possible, we're screwed. We're absolutely screwed. Because there's no way there's going to be an abolition of capitalism and the introduction of a democratic form of life that is not based on workers fighting in their interests, right? The working class is the only social agency that's capable of actually confronting capital, and workers aren't going to fight for a lower standard of living. You know, I think, I mean, what Bhaskar said earlier, I think is actually really important. Maybe it's the case that technological progress will actually be slower under capitalism, because under capitalism, it is an imperative to innovate. Capitalists must innovate or they die. Maybe that'll slow down in a socialist society, in a democratically run society, because people aren't forced to innovate all the time. Maybe it won't. Yeah. Maybe it'll be faster. But even if it is slower, that doesn't undermine the justification for socialism, right? Like if it's the case that like technological progress isn't as fast, but everyone has a decent standard of living, it's just that standard of living doesn't improve as fast as it does for the richest people in the world today. That doesn't take away anything. But if the argument is actually that we're going to do with less, if working class people all around the world are going to do with less than they have now, that's never going to happen, I think. And so if that's it, like if in fact it's not possible, we're in a lot of trouble. The world's headed in a really bad direction.
So it's been around, it's already 8:30, and I think that events on the left don't really go too long. I think they should go no longer than a Michael Bay movie, maybe. So
Well, I think that you've covered a lot of great points, and this is a discussion to continue. We're not going to resolve. These are issues facing humanity and the class as a whole for some period of time to come, probably for most of our lifetimes. And I would like to invite you guys back another time or something along that line.
And just one more note, I have a few more magazines left if anyone wants it. You can have it, they're free, but there's a little note in there imploring you to subscribe. It doesn't have to be tomorrow, but maybe at some point in the next 5 years you'll consider it.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Thank you, Paul. Really good.
That was great. I mean, I feel this great.